Hello, my name is Peter Raymer. Today we're going to talk about how to create a D365 data entity. In the last lesson, we talked about what is a data entity. Data entities allow us to talk to data within Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. They allow outside systems to interact with the data, whether that be reading data or writing data. By default, you cannot access tables directly in D365, but by creating a data entity, you can expose the data within D365 to outside systems, again, both for reading and writing. The other benefit is that within D365 there's a lot of different tables. They have a lot of joins. It can be quite complex for all the different table relations, and that's done for performance reasons and for reducing the size of the data. I definitely recommend you read this article if you haven't already. But with data entities, we kind of normalize the data, and we or denormalize, I should say, the data, and we make it so that we only pick certain fields that we want to interact with, and all those fields are listed in our single data entity. We don't need to understand the structure of all those tables to interact with it. So let's look at an example. So first of all, if we open up Visual Studio and we go to the Application Explorer, which you can go to by going to View, Application Explorer, and then within here, there's Data Model, where we get to see all of our tables. But then there's also data entities and data entity extensions, as well as composite data entities. Let's look at data entities. Within data entities, there's a lot of already existing data entities to allow us to interact with data within the system, whether it be items or customers or vendors or sales order headers or lines or warehouses. For this purpose, let's just look at this data entity here, EcoRes product V2 entity. I can come in here and just type or search for this data entity. There's actually a lot in here, EcoRes product. And then if I keep scrolling, I can actually find the V2 entity here. EcoRes product V2 entity, and as you can see, there's a lot of different variations on the entity. The V2 stands for version 2, so every time Microsoft comes out with a new data entity, they add another number to it so that they're not changing an existing entity and potentially breaking somebody's existing integration. So they'll release V3 or V4 if they add more fields. As we open it up in the designer, which you can do by right-clicking and open designer, you can see this data entity. It's got a data source as well as fields. And so here's all the fields that are on our data entity that we can potentially read or write to. But then behind the scenes, they actually cover a bunch of different tables. So we've got EcoRes product and then all of these different data sources. And if we actually look at the properties from these data entities, we can see that they're covering a bunch of different products. So all that's some good review, so you understand when we're trying to create a data entity, what does one already look like? So we kind of understand what we're going for in the end. So let's jump right into how we actually create a data entity in Visual Studio. So the first step we need to do is you need to create a new project. So I've already created a project called Tutorial Data Entity, but you can do that by going to File, New, Project, and then pick your finance and operations project type or search for it within here. Then you can say next, you can give it a name and then click create. So I've already done that. I'll exit out. The next thing that's really important to do is right click on your project and specify your model. In my case, I've got a custom model called Dynamics 365 Musings. You can create that, or you can use the fleet management model if you want to for this example. But normally you're going to create data entities in your own custom model, and then if you're doing a data entity off of a base table, you just need to make sure your model has a reference to those base tables. So in this case, we're actually going to follow a Microsoft kind of tutorial, and we are going to create a data entity based off of this FM customer. I can see FM customers of type fleet management. If you were doing a data entity on another table, you would look for what's between those parentheses. And then in your model, you can read my article on updating model references, but you can go to extensions, Dynamics 365, model management, update model parameters. And then here you can pick your model. In this case, I've got Dynamics 365 Musings. Click next, and then make sure that whatever table or whatever model your table is in, that you've got a reference to that. So if I scroll down, I'm going to check this fleet management checkbox, click next, and then finish. So a lot of important steps before we can really create our own data entities. If you're creating a data entity on your own table that exists in this model, then you don't need to do these extra steps. So now that we've got a project, the next thing we need to do that's important is right-click on that project and select Properties, and make sure this Synchronize database on build is set to true. Part of creating a data entity ends up creating a view in the SQL Server database that matches our entity name. It also creates a staging table, and so we need both of those to synchronize with the SQL Server database. And so if this is not set to true, then it's not actually going to create all the necessary things we need in our SQL database. So make sure that that's set to true, then click OK. All right, we've got our project created, we've got our property set, our model set, our references set. Now let's actually create our data entity. The way we can do that is I can right click on my project and then say add new item, like I would for creating any new item within D365. Then I can make sure this Dynamics 365 items is listed. If you're not seeing that listed, it's probably because you're not in a development environment where D365 is installed. So definitely recommend you either create a virtual machine, which I've got a tutorial for, or within LCS you create a development environment. All right, after you select Dynamics 365 items, you can select data entity as the type, and then you can give it a name. So in this case, I'm going to call this one FM tutorial customer, I think. Yeah, customer entity. So last time I called it FM lab customer entity. This time I'm going to call this one FM tutorial customer entity, just to make sure it's a little different. And then I'll click add. What's going to happen now is the system's actually going to pop up this wizard that's going to help me create my initial data entity. Just in case you're curious, this is following a Microsoft kind of lab. So if we actually go to this page here, build consuming data entities within Microsoft's Learn site, they actually have these steps. And so I'm just wanted to walk through this. This is the exact same if you're going to create your own data entity. In the end, what we're going to do is there is a table called FM customer and another one called FM address table that have fields on it. And so these two tables relate to each other. We're going to create a data entity with a list of fields that allow us to read and write to these two tables from an outside system. So let's go back to our wizard. From here, I can see my data entity names already in there. And then I need to pick a primary data source. My primary data source is going to be my top level data source that any related tables are really children of, that they might exist or might not exist, so we need to pick our main table. In this case, I'm going to look for FM customer. And I think I can type. If I type quickly enough, it'll find it in my list of all of these possible data sources. So I'm going to pick FM customer. Then I'm going to check my public entity name and my public collection name. These are important because this is what the outside system is going to use to call this data entity. And so I'm actually just going to put an FM at the beginning of it. This will be FM tutorial customer, FM tutorial customers with an S at the end. You can name these whatever you want, but it really helps if you make these match your data entity. And then it's also really helpful if you name your data entity with entity at the end. That just helps people understand what type of object it is. Next, there's a staging table. We'll leave that one alone, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's also a view privilege and a maintain privilege that gets created as part of this. So this is all really nice that it's all being done as part of this wizard. I'm going to click next. The kind of next step in this whole process is we need to list initially what fields we want in our data entity. We can change this later if we want to, and add more fields, remove fields, but this kind of wizard allows us to set up an initial list of fields. So what this wizard's doing is it's looking at our primary data source, FM customer, and it's showing us all the fields on that table, and letting us pick which ones we want on our data entity. You can just pick all of them, but usually that's not always what you want. There could be hundreds of fields across a lot of different tables, and that can make it complex for outside systems to truly understand what's going on. So you really just want to pick the fields that you expect that an outside system would need to read or write, kind of based on your requirements, and narrow down the data entity to just those tables. That's also going to help with performance. So what I'm going to do also is click this convert labels to field names. What that's going to do is it's going to change my data entity field names to match what's here in this label field. So you'll notice right here, this is address ID. Once I check this checkbox, this changes it to address rec ID. You know, if I uncheck it, I can go back. So cell phone changes to phone. And so that just more clearly matches my labels. I don't have to do that. And then once I've even done that, I can go ahead in here and even edit the name of these fields as I want. The field on the tables are always going to be the same, but we can kind of adjust what the outside fields actually see. Also, I'm going to uncheck the license image and image, since those are a little bit more complex of a data type. They're container data types, and I'm just going to leave my strings, my int, and my string on these fields. All right, so here's my initial list of fields. The next thing I want to do is I want to add some fields to my data entity that come from a related data source. And so by clicking this little caret icon right here, I can actually see the system has detected that this is a related data source. And so I can click that one right now, and it will add this related data source to my data entity and show me all the fields here. I'm going to leave all those checked, but then I don't want them to have these really long names. And so I'm going to get rid of the prefix on all these names and just leave them their shorter name like this. Once I've done this, I've added all my fields that I want on my data source. They're looking good. I'm going to actually maybe make one other change. If I go back to FM customer, I want to make this driver's license mandatory. This is going to be part of my primary key. So, all right, that's looking good. That's looking good. Now I can finally hit finish to have the system create my initial data entity. So I'll do that. And voila, the system has gone ahead and created several objects for me. It's created my data entity. It's created my security privileges, and it's also created a staging table. So let's walk through what each of those are, and let's explain how you would make changes or further changes now that we've got this data entity created. So what I can do is I can right click on my data entity, say open, or if I find it in the Application Explorer, I can say Open Designer. I can expand the fields and see all the fields that we created. I can come in to this main node here, and I can change my label if I want. I can change my public collection name, any of those fields that I first picked up on that data source. So I'm going to call this one FM Tutorial Customer. Okay. Now that I've done that, I can also see that there are multiple data sources. There's this FM data source as well as my primary address data source that points to the FM address table. And then if I look at my fields, I can see that, yeah, some of them are coming from the FM table, others are coming from the primary address data source. This is really phenomenal. That's the whole kind of point of this data entity. It flattens our fields, makes it much easier for outside systems to kind of understand. I'm going to also go to primary address here and change this is read only to no. That way we can write to this table as well. Next, I want to look at one other thing. If I go to keys, there's entity key. This is going to include the first name, last name, driver's license by default. I need to make sure that whatever is in this entity key field does contain a unique set of fields. That's really important. So whether that's, for items, that might be item ID. For customers, it could be customer ID. Sales orders, it'd be sales ID. In this case, first name and last name by themselves wouldn't be enough. So we've got driver's license in there as well. Now we've got a unique key. If I wanted to, I could go ahead and add more fields to this list. If I had additional fields, say I wanted to add this license image back, I could just click, drag it to this fields, and it would add it to my data entity. I can also delete it by right-clicking and deleting it. And so it's very simple to add fields from our existing data sources to our data entities. In the end, I'll hit save. I want to talk about one other thing as well. So there is a staging table. The staging table is what the system uses to help interact with the data as we're bringing it in and reading it out. So it's really just handled by the system. You do not need to create it or touch it yourself. But as you saw, the wizard will do that for us. And then if you make any changes to your data entity, you just want to right click and say update staging table. And that will kind of sync any new fields we've added or changes to the entity key to this staging table. If I open up that staging table, I can see that it's going to have the same list of fields plus a couple extra as our data entity, and it's also going to have a similar index plus a couple fields. Again, we shouldn't be touching this staging table directly. We should just always use that update staging table. If you get some major errors and things are not going right, you can delete this staging table entirely and then right click on this and say regenerate staging table and recreate it, and that should fix some kinds of errors. It would kind of be nice if we didn't even have to be aware of this staging table, but I think there are some scenarios where you could get stuck that way. So this is exposed to us within Visual Studio. All right, now that I've created this data entity, I want to right click on select build and then click build solution and make sure that Synchronize on database is set to true on your project. This will go ahead and build our object as well as sync our tables to the SQL Server database, and then we're really all set to check it out. After this build has finished, we can actually see this data entity within the data management framework within D365. So I'll just let this build finish and then continue on with the video. Okay, now that our build has completed, we can actually go to Visual Studio, refresh our session. We can search for data management in this top bar. And specifically, we want the one under System Administration Workspaces. And that'll bring up this form. We can also get to there by clicking on Workspaces along the side and then going down to Data Management. This will take you to the same place. Once you're on this workspace, you can see that there's a tile called Data Entities. You can click on that data entity and it'll show you all the data entities that are set up in the system. And as long as you built correctly, the system should see your new data entity that you created. So we'll go ahead and scroll down. You can also filter, but I'm going to scroll down to the F's here, and we can see the one that we just created, the FM tutorial customer entity, as well as the one that I created before, the FM lab customer entity. And that's it. So in this lesson, we created a D365 data entity. In subsequent lessons, I'll show you how you can test and use these data entities to read data and write data to the system from an outside system. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you watching. If you liked the video, click the like button. I also invite you to push the subscribe button as well. If there's other topics you would like to see a video on, please post in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I hope you learned something new today. Thank you.